This is Brenda Nicholson again, and I'd like to welcome you to the first episode of my recording project, The Appearance of Good. If you haven't listened to my introduction episode, you may want to go give it a listen. It gives a brief history and background of who I am and my qualifications to speak on these subjects. I spent 40 years as a believer in fundamentalist Mormonism. I attended thousands of meetings and was carefully trained under 3 prophets with a very up-close and personal education under Warren Jeffs. I'd like to begin this project by establishing a sort of baseline to work from. Throughout the past decade, whenever I've addressed the negative aspects of what has taken place in my community, telling my personal experiences, what I witnessed, the doctrine and practices that I was raised in, I get accused of othering the people of my community. I truly believe that this is a mischaracterization of my stance and my goals. I believe that there is power in telling the truth, in telling the things that I was pressured into keeping quiet. Evil thrives in secret, in the dark corners that we aren't allowed to shine light into, and no one fights harder to keep secrets than those who benefit from the silence. I take pride in being able to say that so far, no one from my community has accused me of lying or being dishonest, though I have had some who informed me that I don't need to tell so much, even if it is true. The concept of othering is very real. It is a tactic often used to dehumanize people. Very often, people that you don't even know and haven't taken the time to understand. But these are people that I do know intimately, and my effort is to do exactly the opposite. I'm trying to humanize them. Most of those who make accusations of othering are not from my religious community. They either don't understand anything about the level of indoctrination we are subjected to, or maybe they just don't care. But it's not difficult to understand if you educate yourself on the ways that cults and indoctrination in general works, that those involved at the upper levels are actually masters at othering. The FLDS are masters at othering. All my life I was well trained to understand that there are 3 very narrow boxes to place people into: saints, Gentiles, or apostates. Saints could only be found among those members of our specific group of fundamentalists. We were the Lord's chosen people, the heart's core of the righteous, the few out of billions of our Heavenly Father's children on earth, the only ones who were pleasing in His sight, the very elect, as it were. We were taught that we must come out of the world and be not partakers of her sins. We were to be a peculiar people, easily differentiated from the worldly people around us. Being different and separate was a requirement, and we took pride in it. We were instilled with a sense of superiority over others, all others. We were the very elect. The world, the major events of history, everything revolved around us. Anyone outside of our very secluded ranks had to be pigeonholed into one of the 2 remaining boxes, Gentile or apostate. Gentiles are those who have never been part of the true gospel. They are ignorant in their wickedness, oblivious, and weak-minded, easy targets for the whispered promptings of the devil. They were his minions, controlled and manipulated to work against the true work of God and those who seek to do God's will. As children, we were warned severely against the dangers of Gentiles, and especially the government. We were told that they were agents of the devil, that lawmakers and all outsiders were intent on our destruction. Yes, there was much evil in the world, and it was all focused on and directed towards us, the few. But what was even worse than Gentiles? Apostates. Apostates are those who knew the truth, had made covenants to obey God no matter what, and then made the choice to deny the truth, apostates are traitors to God. I believe othering is absolutely happening, but which side is it really coming from? I found a few articles on the subject that I'd like to quote from here in an effort to gain a better understanding of what othering entails. I will link to them below. I'll be reading from an article titled "What is Othering?" from the website Very Well Mind, and another called "Us versus Them" from The Guardian. Othering is a phenomenon in which some individuals or groups are defined and labeled as not fitting in with the social norms of another group. It is an effect that influences how people perceive and treat those who are viewed as being part of the in-group versus those who are seen as being part of the out-group. Even being a faithful member within the FLDS isn't enough to be fully accepted. There are distinct classes and layers of hierarchy that are fostered and reinforced on every hand. A problem that was greatly worsened by implementing the United Order. It widened gaps and created internal groups of others. Othering also involves attributing negative characteristics to people or groups that differentiate them from the perceived normative social group. It is an us versus them way of thinking about human connections and relationships. This process essentially involves looking at others and saying, they are not like me, or they are not one of us. Us versus them. We were God's chosen. They were fallen, degenerate tools of Satan, hell-bent on destroying us. A few signs of othering to look out for from the Very Well Mind. Attributing positive qualities to people who are like you and negative qualities to people who are different than you. Believing that people who are different from you or your social group pose a threat to you or your way of life. Refusing to interact with people because they are different from you or your social group. Thinking of people outside your social group are not as intelligent, skilled, or as special as you and your group. Thinking of people only in terms of their relationship with specific groups without giving any thought to them as individuals. We were God's chosen people. The world revolved around our welfare. And the Gentiles should be grateful that they also benefited from the blessings God provided to us, His most favored people. Blessings like scientific knowledge and medical care. We were taught that those things were provided by God to take care of us, and He was kind enough to also let it benefit the Gentiles. We were taught that the world was against us, that all the powers of Satan and his imps were focused on our destruction. We were taught to answer them nothing and come out of her, my people. And oh, the pride we took in being the best. We patted ourselves on the back and bragged about things like building a house in a day and other ambitious construction projects. But it's not difficult to outperform others when your entire life is ruled by work. When you have thousands of people available at your beck and call. Control the schools, businesses, housing, and eternal salvation of every man, woman, and child in your community. It gives you a distinct advantage. The leaders monopolize the wealth and resources. They utilize child labor and forced labor, wage fraud, welfare fraud, and so on. There was never any consideration given to those outside of our ranks. They were just Gentiles who got what they deserved. And when bad things happened to people outside of our group, there wasn't compassion or understanding extended toward them. Othering can also arise as a way to justify the past or current mistreatment of others. or, as I often witnessed, as a way to reinforce, through fear, the importance of compliance to the leaders. The FLDS and most religions tend to narrowly define who qualifies as a full member of their society. It's not about liking or disliking someone. It's based on the conscious or unconscious assumption that a certain identified group poses a threat to the favored group. Othering can be a way of thinking some people deserve what they got. This helps people cope with feelings of cognitive dissonance or the discomfort they may feel when they hold two conflicting beliefs, or when their beliefs do not align with their behavior. A demagogue understands the power of language. It is not necessary that these demagogues believe what they say. Often, the language used is designed to activate people's anxiety and fear around a perceived other, creating new processes of exclusion and dehumanization. Othering is socially and culturally constructed. When we break, pulling away from other groups, it makes it easier to believe false stories of us versus them, supporting practices that dehumanize them. This division leads people to believe that acceptance and tolerance are not possible. One thing that we hear often from FLDS people is that they want there has to be a give and take. The problem is there is no give on their side. It's all take. The opposite of othering, and this is very important, the opposite of othering is not saming, it is belonging. And belonging does not insist that we are all the same. It means we recognize and celebrate our differences. This, othering, is the life I was raised in. A world where hard lines were drawn with no neutral parties. There were allies and enemies. You are either for or against God, period. There was no middle ground. My entire life, I was regaled with faith-promoting stories on one hand and tales of warning on the other. I never questioned that leaving or losing faith was worse than a death sentence. It would bring a complete separation, shame, and disappointment from family and community in this life, and eternal destruction and damnation in the next. Appeals to fear and ego as vehicles to control thoughts and behaviors are common in high-demand religions. Raising children in extreme black or white, good or evil, us versus them thinking, especially in isolated environments, creates problems. In fact, it is dangerous. When only two options are presented, there are no real choices available. Life is not an either-or situation. Nothing is all black or all white. No one is all evil or all good. But when you believe that to be true, it becomes difficult to trust yourself because perfection is impossible. It dehumanizes. It traps people in a world of fear, bigotry, and loathing, not only against the other, but against their authentic selves and the pieces of the other that they recognize in themselves. All the little ways in which they aren't perfect. It turns family and friends who choose a different path into instant enemies. An enemy who you're told wants to destroy you. On the other hand, if you stay, submit, obey, and comply, molding yourself into exactly what the leaders want you to be, you will be part of a super special elite club, better than everyone else. Among the few who will survive the coming destructions, the only ones who God really loves. And what is more powerful than God? What could be worse than disappointing God? As the terms and expectations of compliance grow more restrictive, apostates become the greatest real threat to unfettered control. Apostates are your family and friends, people who understand on an intimate level the indoctrination and tools of control that are in play. They're familiar, your siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, people who share not only the same upbringing, but the same DNA, people who were once loved and trusted. They have immeasurable potential and power of persuasion that outsiders can never wield. They can speak the language and bridge the gap between the group and the outside world. They can testify that the world isn't as evil as it was made out to be. This introduces legitimate questions and doubts. The blind submission and faith so needed for successful group control cannot withstand questions, so the character and credibility of the defectors must be undermined and attacked. One common tactic used is relating exaggerated anecdotes about the misfortunes, struggles, and hardships of those who left. We often heard how empty and dark and miserable apostates were, how they had big empty holes in their soul where their faith and God's love used to be. The faithful saints were often tested. Being tested was portrayed as proof of faithfulness. While the wicked were punished, punishment was portrayed as proof of God's wrath upon you for sins committed. The problem comes in that the only difference between a test and a punishment is how much the leadership likes you, how much you are in their favor. I've witnessed where the birth of a child with disabilities was, in one case, hailed as wonderful proof of valiance in the pre-existence, and in another case decried as proof that the mother had committed a sin. If you're accident-prone, it could either be that Satan knows you're destined for greatness, so he's trying to destroy you, or the Lord is trying to wake you up by giving you another chance to do better. I mean, he could have killed you, but in his great mercy, he only let you suffer as a wake-up call. Trouble is, on the outside, both look exactly the same. Othering is when children are no longer allowed to live at home, when people are disowned, abandoned, shunned, and made an example of because they no longer comply. It is damaging to believe that your family and friends are turned over to the buffetings of Satan. It's cruel. It's a fear tactic, and it's not healthy. Oh, the leaders will feign concern, but follow it up with victim blaming and guilt. It was so hard to see so-and-so yesterday. They've become so darkened, but that's what happens when you turn traitor to God. I heard these things said all my life. I remember being instructed to pray for the death of some who had turned away. We prayed that the opposition would get discouraged and leave. When I left, I knew these things would be said against me too, whether it was true or not. When I attended the court hearings for Lyle Jeffs, John Wayman, and others in the snap fraud case, it was the first time I had come face to face with these men in years. I was nervous. I knew they were going to judge me harshly, so I put forth a conscious effort to show outwardly how happy and free I was, so that if they went back and reported that I looked unhappy and dark, they were going to have to lie. I knew, without a doubt, that they were othering me to my own family and community, making a judgment and accusation based solely on the fact that I was no longer in the group, without any consideration that I was actually still a good person. In fact, a better person, because I refused to continue down a harmful path. Toward the end of my time in the FLDS, I began seeing things differently. It was a struggle for me to figure out how to address issues that were happening right in front of us. things like abuse of all kinds and horrific animal cruelty. I knew that I wasn't supposed to judge others, and I had to try to find a way to condemn actions without condemning the people committing those actions. We had some boys who lived on the same block with us, who made a habit of wandering into the other yards and killing animals in horrible ways. They told my boys, in gruesome detail, some of what they had done in the past, and I was mortified. I could not allow my children to think that sort of behavior was okay. I gathered them up and I told them to stay away from those boys and explained that what they were doing to animals was not okay. When one of my sons responded with, "Yeah, those kids are acting like Gentiles," it struck a nerve. I realized that in our community, words like evil and wicked were often used interchangeably with the label of Gentile. But in that moment, I knew I had to speak against it. I told my children, no, they're not acting like Gentiles. In the Gentile world, they don't have a lot of tolerance for animal cruelty. If we were living in a Gentile neighborhood, I would call the police, and they would have serious consequences for killing and torturing animals like that. Most Gentiles are doing the best they know how with what they understand. Sadly, I cannot say the same for some priesthood people. From that day forward, I never allowed my children to call all Gentiles wicked. It was a good first step. These are things that I witnessed firsthand. I saw the abuses with my own eyes. But when I speak more openly about them, I almost always get criticism. I'm told that I'm not helping with the perception that the outsiders have of our community. But that's another thing that I really struggled with on the inside before I left. If speaking the truth, reporting abuse and so forth, was discouraged because it would make us look bad, wasn't that admitting that the things we were doing were actually bad? I have talked about what I see from experience as deep indoctrination. It's very difficult to claim you have a choice when you're raised up under these type of circumstances, isolated, surrounded by only those who agree and repeat the message of what you're supposed to feel, think, say, and believe. It's not a matter of a lack of intelligence that keeps people trapped. It's a lack of access to information, combined with a deeply ingrained prejudice against any information that doesn't match that indoctrination. If there was true choice allowed, they wouldn't be so afraid of other ideas and perspectives. The prejudice is enforced through fear. Fear of damnation, fear of being excluded, fear of abandonment. And all of these are very real and justified fears, caused for the most part by the extreme othering of all people outside of the FLDS. When I express my sympathy for girls and women who live polygamy and say that I wish they could understand that there are other valid choices available and that there is happiness in monogamy, I am not othering them or saying they are less intelligent than I or others are. I understand all too well how much devotion they have to the conditioning. I know that they believe that they chose the life they live, but what I've come to understand since I left is that I never really had any choice at all. Do it or be damned is not a choice. Comply or be cast out is not a choice. There is no pathway to true belonging in a high-demand religion when you are denied authenticity. I've heard and read the stories of women who asked for a release from an abusive man and they were denied. So when they did try to utilize a choice other than just saying yes and complying, they were denied that choice. I often hear people say, I would never live polygamy, and I sure wouldn't let my daughter live it. But if those women want to live it, who am I to stop them? In my opinion, That attitude is where othering occurs. When asked why, people usually respond with comments like, "I could never stand sharing my husband," and "I want my daughter to be in a relationship where she's cherished, not one of many wives." To me, that proves that people do understand, but somehow they have convinced themselves that these polygamist women are different, that they are the other, that they don't have human emotions or needs, that they have no jealousy or desire for intimacy and significance, and thus it's okay to deny them protection and the opportunity of having those things that we demand for ourselves. If you would stand up to protect your daughter from becoming the fifth wife of a man who's old enough to be her grandfather, why don't you stand up for other girls who don't have anyone protecting their rights and freedoms? Why do you feel okay with othering those who are oppressed by religious patriarchy? What makes you believe that these girls are any different than your own? Either polygamist women are just built different, or they aren't. You can't have it both ways. And my take on the situation, having been very much in and now being very much out, is that when we as a society ignore the crimes against women and girls in religion because they aren't like us, we are othering them, and I believe we need to stop. We as a society need to ensure that all citizens truly have their basic human rights protected. Laws need to either be enforced or done away with. The only law that polygamists can justify not complying with is polygamy. And the reality is, polygamy hasn't been prosecuted in Utah for nearly 70 years. But just because they can claim religious freedom for polygamy doesn't mean that they can go against the law. I agree with those who say that consenting adults should have choice in their relationships. There are 3 key words in that sentence. Consenting needs to mean an actual informed consent with true choice that doesn't result in being ostracized. Adults, there is no justification for marrying off children. And choice. There has to be an actual choice. The religious freedom of some men should not be an excuse for committing crimes. Freedom comes with accountability, and in the end, it serves no one when society allows special privileges to the few at the cost of basic human rights of the many. As I go forward in this project, I'll be talking about difficult and often uncomfortable subjects. My goal is to end the othering of my community and other communities and help humanize them so they can someday have the freedom to make their own informed choices. When we know better, we need to do better. Thank you for listening.